Welcome to this AU Press's sponsored webinar on resumes and cover letters, tips from university press professionals. This session is sponsored by Jack Farrell & Associates Executive Search Firm. This session will begin shortly and will conclude at 12 p.m. Eastern. Just a friendly reminder that the session is being recorded and the recording will be sent to attendees within a few days. Also, captioning is available for the session. To enable, please click on the closed captioning button located at the bottom of your screen. The chat box has been disabled. Please type your questions into the Q&A box located in the lower portion of your screen. Our presenters will answer your questions towards the end of the session. With that, I will turn it over to Lyndsey Claro.
Thanks, Alexis. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the AU Press's webinar on resumes and cover letters. I am Lyndsey Claro, the Chief of Staff at Princeton University Press. I'm also last year's chair of the AU Press's Professional Development Committee. So before we dive into what I'm very excited about and what I think is going to be a really lively conversation, I just wanted to cover a couple of things and introduce a little bit more about the Professional Development Committee and the Paths in Publishing program. So as Alexis mentioned, this webinar is hosted by the AU Press's Professional Development Committee and also the Paths in Publishing program. So for those of you that don't know about the committee, the Professional Development Committee's charge is to develop and manage tools, programs, and resources to assist association members in improving their publishing expertise, developing their leadership skills, and enhancing their professional development. The committee works on the mentorship program, some of whom you may be familiar with, programming during the annual meetings, webinars like this, and other resources for AU Press's professionals. So if you are an AU Press's member, you can participate in and join many of these professional development committee programs throughout the upcoming year. The Paths in Publishing program is a free mentorship program to help prepare early career applicants moving into or out of entry-level jobs for the work of applying to, interviewing for, and navigating negotiations of new positions in scholarly publishing. The Paths in Publishing program is run by Rachel Leve, Allegra Marchenko, and Megan Levine at the University Press of Colorado. And you can find out more about PIP by going to their website at pathsinpublishing.wordpress.com. I'll put that in the Q&A just so you have it. And when you go on their website, you can see there are other resources and programs. You can request to be connected with a mentor and sign up for their newsletter. Thanks again to Jack Farrell and Associates for sponsoring, and to Alexis Fagan at AU Presses for organizing us and for allowing me to pepper her with questions at one of the busiest times of the year for AU Presses, and also quick on the heels of her starting her position at AU Presses. So thank you a million times, Alexis. So we're here to demystify the process of applying for jobs at university presses. We're here with experienced resume and cover letter writers. We hope that this session can be as practical as possible. We also understand that technology does sometimes provide some constraints in that, but within that in mind, those of you who made some suggestions during your registration process, we've tried to integrate those questions or those concerns into the presentations. Some we'll try to address in the Q&A session. And as Alexis mentioned, we encourage additional questions during the session. So please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to ask anything that comes up throughout the course of the hour. We'll have hopefully ample time at the end of the more formal presentations to dive into those questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our first panelist, who is Angelica Lopez-Torres, the International Rights Manager at the University of Texas Press.
Thank you, Lyndsey. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the great introduction. So first and foremost, I wanted to thank the AU Press's Professional Development Committee and Paths in Publishing for hosting this very important discussion, and of course for inviting me to participate. To our fearless leader and organizer, Lyndsey, I appreciate all of the work you've been putting to get this together, and I'm so very thrilled to be collaborating with my co-panelists, Kathryn and Bethany. I'm really excited to be learning from them as well. Of course, hello to everybody here today. Thank you for stopping by and submitting your great questions. They've given us a lot to think about. So to reiterate, I'm Angelica Lopez-Torres. I'm the International Rights Manager here at the University of Texas Press. So I'll start with a little bit about my own background, and then I'll go into some very general, very quick tips, and then we can get into further questions. So I have a master's in English, and I got a scholarly publishing certificate with my graduate degree. As many of us tend to do, my start in publishing really started with odds and ends in undergrad and grad school. I think my first real taste into publishing was in undergrad when I was helping a professor prepare his manuscript for publication. I did a bit of light research. I transcribed some interviews for him, gathered some permissions, and I did some very, very light proofreading as well. Later in grad school, I was an editor for an online journal, and I also interned at a mystery trade press, which was really fun. And so then after completing my graduate studies, I applied for the UT Press Fellowship in copy editing. I actually did not last very long in copy editing before a position in acquisitions opened up as an editorial assistant. And so I did that for about 3 years, and then I became an associate editor. I started acquiring in Latinx studies, and I also acquired in Latin American literature and translation. Through the translation list, I started negotiating a lot of deals with agents, Spanish language publishers, and a couple of years later, I transitioned to rights and permissions as a department manager. So throughout my publishing career, I've served on various hiring committees from different departments and all levels of roles. I've read probably hundreds of cover letters. I think I've read hundreds just last year alone. And that's cover letters and resumes, of course. And so that's a range from those who are making the shift from academia to publishing, early career, even those at the very top levels who are, transitioning from other presses. I also often give a lot of informal chats with individuals who are looking to break into the industry or others who are just looking for the next step. And I myself have been in the same role where I've asked for others for informal chats, and I've been very, very thankful for those. So before we dive into the questions, like I said, we've put together some points, some focuses to just give general advice. These are going to be very quick, but I'll try to do each of these some justice. So I often get a lot of questions about resume length and cover letters. I know that Kathryn and Bethany will be diving specifically into the discussion of resumes, like distinction of resumes and cover letters. So I want to give you quick general guidelines about length for each. Truly, I've seen a range, but the ones to me that do the best work are the ones who have succinctly been able to put all of the relevant information of past experience that directly relates to the job you're applying to on a resume, and just being able to distill that experience efficiently on a cover letter, right? So that's usually been 1 to 2 pages for each. I've actually seen CVs that are 20-some pages, and I've seen hiring committees that have asked to pare those down to a couple of pages just to highlight those most important and the most relevant information. In terms of what is relevant for a job in mind, this is one of the questions we got, and I wanted to kind of fold it into my tips. So in my own previous jobs, because of my work with the Latinx study list and now working with international publishers, I mentioned the fact on my application that I was a Chicana and that my first language is Spanish on my application materials. Knowing only that those positions involved knowledge of diverse cultures and that my perspective would inform the approach to the role in the field. However, I haven't always disclosed that information in my own background, knowing well that my application could be discriminated against for having those details up front. So that's something I always caution individuals and tell them, that's really up to you, depending on your own background and whether you think that experience could help better understand the role. Another question I get often is what accomplishments to highlight in a cover letter. So while that will be up to the position you're applying to, I think the very important thing that I always like to mention is that you should be keeping track of your accomplishments and achievements throughout your career so you can quickly access them when you are going to be applying to a role when you are starting to write up your applications materials. It's something I've very much appreciated in the past, just because you're not going to be able to remember some of those details about your achievements months or years later. So this also includes anything that can translate into managerial experience, like managing an author, for example, or vendor expectations that you're managing, sitting on a committee, training individuals, even though if they aren't exactly in your department, giving talks, formal or informal. All of that information I try to capture in a spreadsheet, so that way I can track it, and that way when if I am happen to be applying for a job later, I have it accessible. And then lastly, I know I've talked a little bit longer than 5 minutes now. I also wanted to mention tips for lateral moves or transitions to other departments within or outside your press. After working in publishing, you'll have a very foundational knowledge of the industry, right? So whenever your role may currently be, you're likely interacting with most, if not all, departments at your press. So knowing how your role and others are intertwined and what those transferable skills are that you could apply to another department are really important. So understanding the skills you can gain for your own toolkit from working at another department are also crucial for your own career growth. So to use an example, my own case, when I was an editorial assistant, I was constantly writing agreements. I knew our contracts in and out. I was tracking permissions for all of the projects that I worked on. And so this eventually helped me later on when I was negotiating agreements, when I was working with Spanish language publishers and agents, and eventually also my knowledge of the books in our list from the acquisitions perspective also helped me when I became the role in my own current role of rights manager, because now I have an intimate understanding of our list and books, and that way it helps me when I'm pitching our books. So I really recommend to think about the ways that you are currently already doing the work that could be suitable for another role in a department, in another role in another department or another press. And then make sure, if you're writing this out in a resume and a cover letter, that you make sure that you outline as clearly as possible those details for a hiring manager in any application. That way they know that the foundation is already there and that you've already started, that you're going to be starting at a much grounded level than someone else. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. What great tips. I mean, that idea of just keeping a spreadsheet of your accomplishments, really, I feel like it's a great takeaway for all of us. So second on our panelist of experts is Kathryn Marguy, who was most recently the publicity manager at Hopkins Press before leaving to work in public affairs at the Library of Congress. Kathryn, over to you.
Lyndsey, super grateful to be here and kind of collaborate with these really powerful women on this panel. My name is Kathryn Marguy. I work at the Library of Congress. It's a new role for me. And as a government employee, I have to tell you that anything I have to say represents my thoughts and mine own. I do not represent the Library of Congress. That said, this is new, started in the spring here at the library. And but before that, I spent about 10 years in university press publishing. I started on the acquisitions end of things, like so many do, and then crossed over to the dark side and joined books publicity and marketing, where I really planted some roots in publishing, ended up leading some teams both at the University of Texas Press and finally at Johns Hopkins Press and their books team. Thinking back through the trajectory of my career, informational interviews have been foundational to each of the moves that I've made. When I was an intern at the University Press of Florida, I made a point of scheduling informational interviews with all the department heads to see what they did and understand how my acquisitions role as an intern kind of connected with other pieces at the press. When I was at Hopkins as an editorial assistant and a publicist job opened up, I took that publicist who was leaving out for drinks and asked a little bit about like what that job entailed. And it ended up being just a really good fit. When I could feel burnout sinking into the backs of my eyeballs, I thought about a career move, and I was the publicity manager at Hopkins. I started talking to colleagues who I'd worked with at Hopkins who had left, gone into government work, and asked them a little bit about what their experience looked like and if that was something that would be a good fit for me. The information, I've mentioned this about informational interviews for two reasons. One, it will give you an idea of if this is something you want to do, if it meshes with your personality type, if it's the kind of job that you have a skill set for. And the university press community in general, I think, is largely very open to that. As long as you go in respectful of their time and with really specific pointed questions, I've found the university press community incredibly open to having those conversations. Angie mentioned she takes those calls all the time. So I think that's really valuable. But the other piece is that it will help inform the application materials you end up submitting, right? When you understand the challenges and opportunities of a role, you can be more specific, and you don't just have to, sometimes it feels like a shot in the dark when you're pulling together a cover letter, because these just job descriptions are so vague. So it helps put a sharper point on your cover letter materials. I should say, diving into different tips and tricks of my own, while every single person on this panel I would classify as high achieving, including our fearless leaders with Alexis and Lyndsey, all of these are opinions, right? If there was a standard way to write a cover letter, if there's a standard format for a resume, everyone would be doing it. My hope is that anyone attending this panel takes away tactics to most authentically tell their story, right? Because that's what it's all about. If your resume doesn't quite authentically reflect you, it doesn't quite matter what the format looks like. But what we do know, that the standard thing that we do know, is that hiring managers spend a shockingly short amount of time looking at your application materials. And so the goal is, in my mind, when thinking about how to best relay my experiences, how do I do that with the smallest amount of words in the quickest way possible? Because I know that hiring manager is taking literal seconds to look at my resume. And so things that I have found really useful in a resume is that personal statement up at the top, right? I think it's especially useful when you either don't have a lot of experience, that you can sew a through line and illustrate what you're really passionate about up at the top. But it's also helpful if you've got a lot of different experience, maybe you're making a career change or a change to a different department, right? That you can link together a through line for you. So my through line is that I am a communicator at heart, really interested in making sure evidence-based information is available to all, breaking down barriers for that, right? Making a solid theme for your working career. And maybe it's aspirational, like what you want that career track to be if you're especially early career looking to break into publishing. I would also say I'm a really big fan of these bulleted lists of experiences up at the top, right? Again, thinking about truncating information, pulling out bulleted lists of skills that you've got. So a hiring manager knows this is what I can expect from them: marketing, social media, multitasking, team leadership, perhaps. Those things will be borne out, right, in the nitty-gritty of your work experience. So I think that's really useful. The other big thing for me is quantifying everything that you can. If I work at a coffee shop, serving customers coffee is the description. But if you say, I serve hundreds of people in a 4-hour shift, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get a much sharper picture of the scale of the work that you're doing. If you're an editorial assistant looking to move up, it's how many projects did you work on? Were they image heavy projects? Like those kind of things add texture and let a hiring manager know really quickly the fullest picture of the job that you've performed in that particular role. Cover letters, recommendations, write one. I mean, especially for marketing, you have so few opportunities on paper to stand out. Writing a cover letter shows that you care a little bit, especially in marketing, in publicity in particular, where you would end up, if you worked on my team in publicity, pitching books. A cover letter is the opportunity to pitch yourself. Please, God, write a cover letter. Let's see, you can use a template, but leave space in there to make sure that it's catered toward the role, and use it to tell stories. Build on your resume. Don't just reiterate it. Like, I did this, 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 and this. Use the cover letter as an opportunity to tell stories, drag out examples of a time when you went above and beyond, or illustrated a skill set that would be directly applicable to the job you're applying for, but also to show that you did a little bit of research on the company itself. Are there books that you think are really exciting, or signal posts for why you're interested in working there, or projects that they're working on, initiatives that they have announced that are something inspiring or exciting that you want to learn more about in that role? So that's my kind of quick and dirty look at tips. I should also say, as a quick plug for Paths and Publishing, if you have a cover letter and resume that you want feedback on, there is a way to get direct feedback from the professionals and the mentors at PIP. It's really easy to do, and you can get pretty quick feedback if you're clear about what your timeline is. So that's me. I'm looking forward to diving into questions later.
Thanks, Kathryn. That was also incredibly useful. A lot of information to kind of process in that. So last but certainly not least is Bethany Wasik, who is acquisitions editor at Cornell University Press, acquiring in the fields of classics, archaeology, modern European history, and military history. Go ahead, Bethany.
How can I follow those two? There was so much good information in there. Okay, well, I'll try. So thank you to everyone involved, as they mentioned as well. This is a really neat opportunity to come together with some people I really admire in publishing, who have a lot of good advice already. So I, as Lyndsey mentioned, I am an editor at Cornell University Press. I've been here for just over 7 years. I came in as an acquisitions assistant, and within 2 years maybe or so became an assistant editor, and for just over a year now I have been a full editor in all that long list of categories that Lyndsey mentioned I acquire in. But I came to this job from academia. I got a PhD at Indiana in molecular biology and genetics, in the very hard sciences. And then I did 2 postdocs, one at Yale and one at Cornell, which is how I ended up in Ithaca. With the goal, or rather following the trajectory of a tenure track faculty position. And it was during my postdoc at Cornell, about halfway through, I realized I liked certain aspects of the career than others. And those included writing and reading about content, scholarly communication, peer reviewing, putting together grants and reading my colleagues' grants. Those were the things that stuck out to me that I really enjoyed. And I started thinking about what can I do, or what sort of career exists where I can do those things. And publishing was the easy answer to that. And so I started doing my own research and looking into what resources were available to enter into that sort of job. And I had a great experience with the Office of Postdoctoral Affairs at Cornell. They gave a lot of really excellent workshops, one of which was how to convert your CV into a resume. And it turns out I have transferable skills, which I had not thought about at all before. And so that was really useful in figuring out what those were. And then they also connected me to someone who had come from the academia and the sciences, who was a journal editor at a science journal. And I had a great conversation with her, and all the parts about her job that she was mentioning sounded perfect for what I wanted to do. So those 2 things alone were really, really useful in helping refine what I wanted and what sort of jobs to start looking for. And conveniently, an assistant position came up at Cornell Press right when my postdoc funding was running out. And so I applied to it, and that's how I ended up here. But part of the reason, that was asked to be on this panel as well is that experience of converting my academic experience into one that fit publishing in both my cover letter and resume. And it was really figuring out what those transferable skills were, figuring out what relevant experience I had, and putting that right at the top of both. And that included, I had a number of publications. So I'd written and I'd published on my own. I'd been to a lot of conferences and communicated my science research that way. Training and mentoring. I had done teaching. It was something I wasn't pursuing just because I didn't like it as much as the other stuff, but I'd done it. So I knew how to convey that sort of, do that sort of communication. And so all of this together required a lot of framing and developing, a sort of narrative for the cover letter and resume that I had to work on. And so to kind of build on what Angelica and Kathryn were saying, in terms of tips, that's the background I'm coming from, is how to properly frame your experience to fit that, or the place or the publisher where you're applying. And I've been on a number of hiring committees here already, where I've seen a lot of the wide range of how you can do that. And I think the biggest tip I think to come away with is to really focus in, especially on your cover letter. Why are you applying for this job, and what is it about this publisher? What is their mission? Why do you want to be a part of it, and how will you contribute to it, as opposed to, I really like books, I've always loved reading books. And that comes up a surprisingly large amount of time in these cover letters. And just know that we know you like books, that's why you're applying. But what is it about our books? What is it about the subject areas or the imprints? How important is scholarly communication to you? Those are the things I think to, as Kathryn said, succinctly point out in your cover letter that are going to really be impactful in the end. And then the only other thing that comes to mind, as Kathryn said too, include all the material, include a cover letter when it's required, and then also have other people read it. Have colleagues in, whether publishing colleagues or in whatever field you're in, have them look it over and have some outside eyes look and say, well, this doesn't seem as important as this is. That's what I did when I was applying. I had colleagues who had publishing experience, and then colleagues from the academic sciences also look at my material and point out, well, you're focusing too much on this and not enough on this. And so I think that's really, really helpful when you're applying for jobs, and things come up that you just didn't see. And I think that's going to be that's good, a good tip to take when you're especially going into a new field. Oh, and one more thing that I was supposed to mention too, and especially in light of the questions we got, I'm also interested more lately, and I'm thinking more about cover letters and resumes, because I want to get experience to eventually be in an editor-in-chief or an editorial director position, and develop management and leadership skills. And this, and now that Angelica said about the spreadsheet, I'm blown away, and I need to start recording all this stuff. But I'm taking our HR department at Cornell has supervising modules, virtual workshops. There's leadership retreats at Cornell that I'm signing up for. And these are the things now that I'm thinking about, like, what can I take advantage of right now for these future positions, for these future, this career trajectory. And so I think that's also something you should be consistently thinking about. What's going on now that I can take advantage of that will be good for a cover letter, for a resume, whether it's into a management position, into a new field like publishing, etc. Okay, now I'm done.
Thanks, Bethany. Again, so much information, chock full in about 5 minutes. So we have the remaining time in our hour webinar for Q&A, really. So we have a few questions that have come through. If you have more questions, please pop them into the Q&A area of the webinar. Just for my own purposes of needing to be organized, I thought we could kind of like theme some of these questions. So the first theme that I think the two of these questions that just came through actually fall within the umbrella of our kind of what I'm calling the nitty-gritty of cover letters and resumes. So we've gotten a lot of great tips already, I think, in the past 30 minutes about, really specific things that come up when you're working on a cover letter or resume. But just to kind of add to that, we have a question that came through in the Q&A about, Kathryn, what you were saying about adding quantitative information to a resume. And I also think it's a really interesting and great idea. Are there any other examples of what kind of information you could think of that, that an applicant could quantify? Yeah,
sure. And maybe I'd love to hear Angie and Bethany's thoughts on this too. I'm thinking about in my publicity manager role, sitting at the top of my resume, right? I'm thinking about how many books I worked on, if there was a case where we had a banner year for publicity, right? So we saw a 20% increase in media hits, and that resulted in X amount of revenue generation, right? On the other end, one of my earliest things on my resume is I worked at a bookstore for a while, right? And so I hosted community events. So I hosted, over my tenure there, I served over 3,000 customers. I hosted 10 book events, community events at the bookstore, and it generated X amount of dollars in revenue. Each event generated this amount of money for the bookstore. Things like percentages of the percentage of revenue that your work represents or supported, I think is also useful. Like when I was in acquisitions, like I worked for some of the highest producing editors at the press, right? That their revenue represented X amount of the larger publishing budget. Those kind of things I think helped illustrate and quantify the work that I did.
I was going to add, because I saw that question, I remember specifically as an editorial assistant, I would track any new things that kind of landed on my plate. I would track how much time I was spending on it. And was there any way that I was maybe streamlining the process? Was I saving the editor's time? All of that, I would put it in even a annual review. I would say, this is how much time I spent doing this, but I also streamlined it, and this is how much time I'm saving now. So all of those things are really helpful. Whatever, even if it's just time that you're saving, the number of authors you have helped, all of those things you can put numbers to.
So from my end, I used to, as an assistant, keep track of how many projects I was transmitting to editorial and production. And I've lost track now, but I have a spreadsheet from at least up to about a year ago. And it was really helpful when applying for positions or even the annual review or performance review, knowing on average how many I was transmitting a season, which then you can convert into other things like how many authors you've worked with as an assistant, or how often or how much you work with the other departments based on all of that sort of work. So yes, that's actually a really helpful thing to keep track of, at least as an assistant.
And I think also this idea of figuring how it can be quantified in non-publishing experience too is a really key thing too. I mean, I'll use, if I can use myself as an example, I worked at a doctor's office for a brief period of time when I was in graduate school, and I was really just trying to make ends meet, right? Like that was my prime directive, was to just get that paycheck. But it taught me things about an office environment, and I could certainly see being able to quantify the number of doctors that I supported and nurses that I supported on a daily basis, the number of patients that came through, the number of appointments we made. Those sorts of things actually do show that you're kind of used to a certain kind of an environment, you're used to customer service, and you can leverage that in your cover letter and resume. So we have a question about chronological versus functional resumes, both in the UP world and for early career professionals. Any strong opinions about whether a resume should be chronological or functional?
I mean, I think this is why I love the idea of pulling out your big experience points at the top, because I prefer, again, there's no template. I prefer a chronological resume, but that I can pull out the things I think are most important up at the top so that you don't miss them. You know that they're somewhere within my resume, but whatever feels most authentic to you.
I think it depends, right? So chronological at least works for me now that I've been in publishing, that, shows up more recently. When I was putting together my resume to make the transition from academic to publishing, I feel like I didn't have it by year necessarily. I had it by section. And so it was like relevant experience at the top. And so the things with time kind of felt chronological, but they were kind of in separate chunks, right? I put my education, I think, more towards the end, and the more details about my postdocs and the actual scientific research like later on. I like I said, now it's probably more chronological, but I think it depends on where you're coming from and really highlighting those sort of transferable skills that way. It may be a better option. But again, there's no template, as Kathryn said. But maybe it's just like, what do you want the hiring committee to see first, too? What,
Yeah.
if you're, I mean, I don't know. I don't really have a strong opinion about whether resumes should be 1 or 2 pages. Mine, I think it's 1 now, but there's certainly stuff that I've left out of it, you know. But if you're just scanning a whole bunch of these, you want to have the most important stuff first, and that may not fall out chronologically.
Yeah, that was the only thing I was going to ask. Like, is it accessible in the first chunk, half of the page? Then that's the most important thing, the most relevant experience.
So a related question that's come through is, at what point do I let my non-publishing experiences like undergraduate student work, TAing in grad school fall away from my resume and use that real estate for industry specific information? Any thoughts on that?
This might be a question for Bethany too, since she has background in academia, but I feel like the grad school and TAing experience can also relate. You manage students, you're probably already managing authors in your current role. So those are things that are related, and how you make those connections are important. Probably more so you can highlight that in a cover letter than in the resume, but either way, that's still relevant information to include.
Here's where the spreadsheet that Angelica was mentioning comes into play. At least more recently for me, I've started acquiring in archaeology and military history and European history, and I have this really complicated science background. So how does that play into it? I actually minored in anthropology and did an archaeology emphasis in college that I kind of did and didn't think, much about until it came up as a possibility here. And I have a lot of family members that are in the military. And so I grew up around that sort of environment and a lot of books and visiting those types of places. So I do have some sort of knowledge of it. And I've also, in college, I volunteered at the local natural history or the history museum and cataloged and, did these little things here and there that I didn't really think much about, but thought were interesting at the time. And while they're not going to be on every resume or in every cover letter I have, it does sort of play into very specific ones. So that's also another thing to keep in mind too when you're applying for jobs. Make sure to curate certain things for certain jobs. You don't have to send the same cover letter and the same resume to every job. Take the time to make it specific and try and recall these experiences you have. And that's something to mention in the cover letter that'll make it stand out a little.
So the next kind of batch of questions, I think, is really based around the kind of theme of moving to a higher level job or moving kind of to a different kind of job. So our first question question starts with, I'm intimidated even thinking about applying for a higher level job, especially when moving from something like assistant editor to full editor to senior editor. How do you prove you're ready for this higher job if you haven't done it yet? This seems especially intimidating when I think about moving presses. And I think I would add to this a question about managing people. How do you prove that you can manage people when you've never managed people before?
Right there with you when I was moving to a manager role, and I was like, how do I do this? That spreadsheet, sorry that we all keep going back to that. It really helps you take inventory of things that you've done that already are feeding into that. In terms of like, how do you prove you're ready? Think about the soft skills that you need for a managerial role. I read a lot about this myself, just because I needed to prep myself. But think about what those skills that you, the managers and leaders that you know and admire, like how do they work with others? How do they make decisions? How do they learn? How do they, maybe even learn and back up their decisions? Are they collaborative? Are they emotionally intelligent? I feel like that's one of the most important things for leadership, but that I feel like don't get translated into applications. Like being an emotionally intelligent person helps you to be a leader, because you are dealing with people. So maybe you're thinking, oh, I need to learn how to manage others. Maybe you're already doing that. You're working with authors. You're probably managing their expectations, or if it's not an author, a vendor, or people that you're already working with. I think a lot of the time people think that as a manager, I'm kind of bossing people around. Really, that's quite the opposite. I'm just making space to listen to others and making sure that they have everything they need from me, so that I can prepare them and trust them with their work that they have. That they know that I have full trust in them and that they can come and ask me questions. So what are the things you're already doing in that way? But also some of the other things that aren't like soft skills. Maybe you've trained someone at work. Maybe you've already given presentations, presented projects. Maybe you've done these chats. Any of those resources that you can kind of pull experience from. Those are all great things to think about.
I think you're absolutely right, Angie, like combing through your resume for those manager level kind of skills to accentuate. But Bethany brought up a great point about using the resources. If you're looking for that next step at a university press, and you're at a university, to use the oftentimes free resources, classes, to add that line item on your resume. Like the Hopkins had, through the business school, had fantastic strategic leadership classes that not only are a nice thing on paper, they look great on paper, but it gives you the confidence to say, oh yeah, I could do this. Like it is not this mythical other thing, that it is very much within the realm of possibility that you could take on a role like this, and that you've got the skills, that it won't be completely new to you. You've got some training there under your belt as well. It's free, take advantage of it. I feel like that was one of the things at Hopkins that people just didn't know. There wasn't an awareness of the resources available to you. And most universities have this kind of thing available for their staff.
And I'm just going to add on to what Kathryn said about confidence too. Like I'm not doing these, I'm doing these things because I'm interested in them, not just, for a resume or now a spreadsheet, line item, but also it's good to just take advantage of whatever you can to know if you actually want to do it, right? And then you're going into your cover letter, your resume, or performance review, whatever you're doing, and you have the confidence now say, oh, I really do want to do this, and you can explain your interest in it even better or more clearly than having some ambiguous idea of like, oh, I kind of want to do this and I'm just going to sign up for this stuff, so it's there. That's all gonna, and later on, this is not in the topics here, but when you do actually interview, you can then talk about those things in a more confident way as well.
Can I add one more thing? Ask your current leadership if there's anything that you can help with that could help with your own leadership skills. Those things might already be available to within your own press, and you don't know if you don't ask. I'm
gonna jump in one more time too, and just mention, sign up for these mentorship opportunities through AUP or Paths in Publishing or whatever, and you can then and in addition to training people at your press or wherever you are, those are extra kind of things that you can do on the side, and it also helps with networking as well.
So I want to get back to this question of confidence, because this came up in a question, and I was thinking maybe we could talk about it for a couple more minutes. So the person who's posted said, several years ago, I was made redundant. I applied for lots of jobs, got rejected lots of times. I managed to get a different job in the same company, and I narrowly avoided redundancy. My confidence is still shot when I think back to those rejections. Any tips to build my confidence? Boy, isn't imposter syndrome real? That's all I have to say about that. But I'm curious if you all have some tips about kind of like getting back confidence when you've been hit with some blows?
I talk to a lot of others that are in the roles, and I see what advice I can get from others. Going back to the spreadsheet, I'm sorry. When you
Love
see
it.
things written out and you're just like, oh, wait, I did do all of these things. I did accomplish all these things. It's just a different way to kind of, it's not something you see all the time, right? When you don't see it all at once. So when you can go back and see the things you have accomplished, it is a confidence boost that you haven't not done anything for the past year or the past 5 years. Those are really helpful things to kind of wrap your head around. Yeah.
And to know that you're not alone in this. I mean, that is not uncommon. I mean, especially working in publishing, these like periods of getting laid off from a publishing, well, publishing is shrinking and shrinking. Like this is, you are not so far from alone, and there's a community around you to support you and kind of build you up and give you that confidence. You are not doing this alone. It's endemic of publishing.
I would just add very quickly that in addition to all this, that you know, I think that most of us are typically our own worst critics, and that can be a very it can be really hard to kind of like talk yourself up, right, and believe in yourself. And so one thing that could be useful, and I've done this in various trainings, but is to actually talk to someone who's kind of a confidant of yours, but not a person. I mean, it could be a personal person, but it could be a work confidant, and just kind of talk about what they think your skills are and what they think your strengths are. There's also strengths assessments, a whole ton of strengths assessments online. And actually, when you end up doing these strength assessments, that a variety of which you can, you know, take, sometimes things that you think may be negatives about your personality actually are framed as strengths. And so that, you know, I just think somehow getting a neutral perspective it can be very useful, because we all have strengths and we all have areas that aren't our strengths. And that's a totally normal thing to kind of like to kind of deal with on a daily basis throughout your life. But just being able to kind of frame it for yourself and have other people frame it for you, I think helps put things into perspective.
I hard second that, like looking for strength finders. Like I took a Nielsen strength finders class a couple months ago, right? And especially if you are looking for like new power words, or to create like a larger through line for your resume to better tell your story, that's a great way to do it, to get fresh words from someone who doesn't know you, that this is a nice third party to give you more tools in your toolbox, more words to play with as you're kind of describing your skill set and experience.
This is similar to what I came away with from the converting your CV to a resume and learning more about transferable skills. I hadn't thought about them at all before that. And that was a neutral, it wasn't a science, you know, focused workshop. It was very general, but it was a really nice experience to try and think about these things and figure them out in wording, like Kathryn said, terminology for a cover letter.
Absolutely. I took something similar too. I used to be very down on myself because I wasn't a quick decision maker, and you're supposed to be a decision maker. And it's just like, oh no, you're a thoughtful decision maker and you want information to back up, and you're not just making decisions based on feelings, and you're actually looking for data. I'm like, oh, got it. So it just kind of reframes a lot of the things that you might have doubts about yourself.
Such great points. So our kind of next bundle of questions is thematically kind of more around lateral moves within a press, moving from a press to a non-press position, and moving from non-press position to press position. So our first question is, I'm curious if the panel has any advice on applying for a position within your current press, knowing your colleagues will be on the hiring committee. How might this differ from an application for a press where you have no prior connection?
you have an advantage, that you know the ins and outs of the press, you know what they, what's important to them and what they have said the 5 years are what they're focusing on. You use those to your advantage in your cover letter. You know that someone has DEI as one of their important topics. That's something that you cover in your cover letter. Things like that. Like you're already telling them, I already know the press, and you don't have to work on training me on the press and the books. Here's what else I'll bring to the role as well.
I think that's a great point. I have had 3 different positions at PUP, and leveraging the sort of institutional knowledge that I already had in my cover letter and resume was key in that process. So we have a question, I think specifically for Kathryn, but I think any of us could answer it if we would like to. How can one present UP experience in applications to non-UP positions?
I understand now why you said that to me. No, so I think I had to reframe my entire resume in many ways, because it was so much less about the peer review process and like books, specifically trade books. I had to completely pull like monographs out of there because it didn't quite translate as well, or it didn't translate quickly, right? And that's my whole motivation in creating my application materials, is how do you translate those ideas as quickly as possible. So it was a shift to focusing on like percentage of revenue, showing the ways in which my work contributed to my press's bottom line, without like revealing industry secrets or like sensitive information, obviously, to anyone at Hopkins who's shopping my resume around. So no, I think looking at illustrating the number of titles really helped draw the pace of work, right? That helped illustrate like a larger manic quality to like my ability to multitask, not manic working. Forgive me. Things like going to conferences, right? Things that I was working with, like scholarly conferences, weren't going to be quite a thing, and so emphasizing different pieces of that, right? So we prepare really academic materials. Well, instead, I would say, translating complex material for a general audience was a big theme, right? In rejiggering my resume toward more non-publishing or publishing adjacent roles. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think just reminds us all that most people who don't work in publishing don't really know much about publishing. Perhaps save for what is on the latest television and movies about being an editor. So just keep that in mind, that you can generalize and broaden it when you write your cover letter.
It was, what was a helpful instrument for me was, would my dad understand the value of the work that I did, who famously has just no idea how publishing works. They've never quite figured out what publicity was. How would that translate? If someone had no idea of what I was doing, how would they have a sense of the value of that and the impact that I made in my roles?
Mm-hmm.
So just a tweak. It wasn't it wasn't a total revamp, but it was definitely a tweak. So.
Okay, so let's talk about the converse, which is applying for UPs while coming from another field. Talk more about how to reframe your experience when coming from another field. How do we gain language for what skills, tasks of the new field are? I have trouble reframing when I don't really know what the skills, actions, tasks of the new job are. So I end up just describing what I've done. I teach, I create curriculum, I advise, I mentored. I know it's relevant, but how to talk about it in a way that uses the new field's language?
I have 2 answers to this. One is approach people like us for informational interviews. And we can describe our jobs in a way that uses language that might become more familiar. The other thing is to plug the paths to publishing that Kathryn talked about too, have a mentor of some sort read your cover letter or your resume, or at least send them a note saying, I'm interested in this. Here's my experience. What do you think, or can you help me translate this? I think that's going to at least be the first initial things to do. And also pay attention and research job ads for publishing. What sort of language are they using in the job ad? What sort of responsibilities or tasks are they describing? And then you can maybe focus in on those, look it up, on your own, and get more familiar when you have sort of something to go on, or the certain terminology to go on.
Great tips.
I mean, I'd say for what it's worth, I would say if you could, I'm not sure what department you're looking to work in publishing, but if you can emphasize ways in those different roles that you multitasked, that you worked with a variety of people, that you could synthesize information well, I think those kind of things. Any customer service role, there are very plain.
Communication. Any way you can describe that you can communicate with other colleagues, to other people like authors, to a general audience. I think that's a pretty strong theme to focus on.
Yeah, I was going to say customer service too, because I had someone who was like, oh, I used to work at a store. How do I just, and I was like, yeah, you know how to handle people who are coming at you with insane questions and needs, and you can handle that.
And to know you belong here. You talk to anybody in publishing, they come from all over the place. To discount your experience because it isn't exactly publishing is incorrect. You belong here. We need your experience. There are absolutely ties to it. Publishing, by the way, has a history of not being so inclusive and pulling the same kind of folks in. And so the more diverse background it is, if you can pull those relational things that will have correlation to what you'll do, God, we need you in publishing. We need those people. So I'll get off my soapbox.
I love that. I love that. What a kind of a great like summation of our webinar, Kathryn. I know it's that warmed my heart. It really did.
It's serious. We need you.
It's true. It is very true. And I do think you're right. The more people you talk to in publishing, the more you realize that everyone has these, what appear to be random stories in their lives that actually have kind of like shaped them into the professional that they are. So it's really important to remember that for yourself. So we only have 2 minutes left, and we have like 2 kind of very quick questions in the chat that I was hoping we can address, just so that we won't leave these people hanging. So should personal statements and summaries on a resume be limited to 1 sentence? What's the take of the group on that?
Mine's 2.
Yeah, it's like a couple of sentences is fine.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
Okay, and then this is more of a kind of a logistical question about a Paths in Publishing program. What's the turnaround if you put in a request to have a resume or cover letter reviewed for via the Paths in Publishing program?
It depends, right? You have to be very clear in your initial request about what you need. I think 2 weeks is a nice cushion. 2 weeks is nice, but it depends. You may be able to get, if you say, I need it tomorrow, you may have trouble, but 2 weeks is usually quite nice.
Great.
And I will say, people pay a lot of money. People pay a lot of money to have their cover letter and resume looked at. I think Paths in Publishing is doing just a tremendous service. So make use of it. It's an incredible thing that really busy publishers are making their time available for. And I think it's just the coolest thing.
And I did put in an answer to the question, which was a recommendation about the book, What Editors Do, the link to the Paths in Publishing website, so you can click directly from there. So I wanted to thank all of our panelists today, everyone who attended. This is being recorded, and you should get a copy of it. It'll also be posted on the Paths in Publishing and AU Press's websites. We had a lot to discuss here, and I feel like this is a really kind of rich topic, and we know we could have continued for a half a day talking about resumes and cover letters. So do keep on the lookout for more programming similar to this, including what we're calling part 2 sometime in the fall, which will be a webinar on interviewing tips and tricks. So that as soon as there's a date lined up for that, you'll hear about that. And it will also be co-sponsored by the Paths in Publishing program. So thank you all for taking the time today. I hope you've learned a lot. I know I certainly have.